Good. Perfect. Okay, so we kind of talked about what is a pest and how we traditionally think of them. So we're shifting our perceptions of what that means. Does it mean grab the bottle, or what else can we do? So again, going back to shifting our perspectives, I think one of the big things, I really like this graphic. It says, if something's not eating your plants, then you're not part of the ecosystem. So having a mentality kind of change of, I must have a perfect plant. Whether that's a perfect berry plant, that's a perfect tomato. I'll probably talk a lot about vegetables because that's what I do. But this goes for natives and everything else as well. So like if I see like anything wrong with my plant, I'm like, oh gosh, it's gonna die. It's like, no, it's okay. So it's thinking of like, what is the appropriate threshold of problems? If I just have one little bug eating a little corner of one little leaf, then that's not within my threshold of doing something. It's fine, it's part of the ecosystem. Even if it's maybe a bad bug, I'm watching it, I'm looking at it. Do I see one or do I see 50? Like what is the right amount of things? I think when I started gardening, one of the first things, again, you flip a leaf over and you see aphids, you're like, oh my gosh! And you gotta rip the whole plant out and do different things. And it's like, no, let's see, like, do I see ants on this? Like, are they helping get the aphids? Do I see some lacewing bugs? And we're gonna talk about some of these. Like, do I see other, predatory bugs eating the bad bugs? And if so, we're just gonna let it go. We're gonna see what happens. So it's just changing it, being patient and looking and not freaking out. So again, going back to kind of creating an ecosystem. So thresholds. There's a couple different thresholds that we kind of think about. One of them is economic. So if you are a farmer and my example is kind of talking about soybeans, and if you have a few caterpillars in there, it's okay. It takes more time and money to go through and get rid of those couple of caterpillars than to just let the bugs eat them and things like that. So we know we're going to lose maybe 5% of our crop to that sort of thing. But if I notice like 50% of my crop is a problem, then now it's more economical to take care of the problem because now I'm going to lose more money than it would cost money to fix. Does that kind of make sense for people? So that's kind of the economic thing. Another option is health of the plant. So most plants can take between 25 and 40% defoliation, so leaf loss, before it really hurts the plant. And so whether that's a couple of spots on a bunch of different leaves, or whether that's the whole left side of your plant, things like that. So where is that the health of the plant threshold? And then aesthetic. That's kind of you. Like if I don't, or me, if I see some holes in my plant, I don't like that, so I want to do something about it, versus am I okay with some of that? Going back to perfection. We don't need perfection out of our plant. We want to be part of the ecosystem. And we want to attract birds to our trees. We need a few caterpillars, so that means they're going to eat a few leaves. But the amount of leaves they're eating is not that 30 to 40%, so it's okay. We're gonna let the cycle kind of happen.
Perfectionists are not needed in gardens. Being a perfectionist is not needed in the garden.
Correct. Perfection is not. If you can have perfection in your garden, you're either amazing or you're doing something wrong. You know what I mean? Like you're at that point, you might be in a greenhouse or something where you can control everything. And Tess was talking about, one of the reasons we had lawns for a while was the control of nature. And it's just not meant to be controlled. We can guide it, we can provide different resources for it, and we can do different things, but it's just not something we're going to control. So we're just going to help it the best we can. Okay, so let's go through, there's 6 kind of steps in the integrated pest management system. So the first one is knowledge. This is a big one, and I'm going to kind of challenge you to go home and do this, not necessarily this week, but this season, things like that. The first thing is kind of drawing a diagram of your garden, whether that's your raised beds, whether that's your front or backyard, and kind of jot down different things. So kind of be mindful of that. You can color code it, be like, I got my trees here, my bushes here, my tomatoes there, my cucumbers there, however that's going to look. And then can you identify all of them? Obviously, maybe it's a vegetable garden, you planted them all, hopefully you can. But if you have like your front yard and you've got just different trees and shrubs, you're like, oh, that one's always kind of done its own thing. I think it's a native. Start identifying them and writing them down. And that's also with the Master Gardener program, we try to talk about, the genus and the species of the plant, because sometimes the common name of a plant could be for several different plants. Like a button plant, there's like 3 different kinds that are completely different things. So the correct and proper thing, the scientific thing is knowing the genus and species. I do not know the genus and species of all of the plants in my garden, maybe about half. But I couldn't even tell them to you, and I had to pull on my phone and be like, oh, that's a this. And that's okay, but just being mindful of it, and if it comes with pests or it comes with diseases or things like that, it's a lot easier to look it up if you know what it is. Because that kind of goes into the next thing. What is healthy for that plant? What is normal, what is abnormal? And you kind of need to look at that from different seasons. Because if all the leaves fall off in the fall, that's normal. If all the leaves fall off in the spring, I need to know that that's not normal. Things like that. Plants flower at different times, they give off fruit at different times, so just knowing what the normal is, as well as knowing what the common pests are. So if I've got cucumbers and cucurbits, that's the species or genuses for that particular area. I have the cucumber beetle, I've got the spotted one and the striped one, we're going to talk about those later. And what do they do to my plant? So if I notice my cucumbers have got a bunch of white fuzzy stuff on it, I can be like, the beetles don't do that, I have something else. So the more you just kind of know about your plant to start with, the more you can kind of help diagnose, thank you, I'll get there eventually, different problems that come up later. Also, when you know what it's called, you know how to use it. Is this maybe you found out that you have a hyssop and you're like, I could make tea out of that, I didn't know that. So the more you know about the plants, the more you can use them. You know what we talked about what the pests are. We also need to know what the good things are. Like, what is this plant doing for the ecosystem? Is it feeding caterpillars? Is it feeding birds? Or is it just sitting there and looking pretty? And that's completely okay too. So knowing how you use it, whether it's for cooking, whether it's just because it looks pretty, maybe it's for privacy. Maybe you have some boxwoods and they're just for privacy. Maybe they don't necessarily help the ecosystem as much, but that's okay. All of these are good. It's just important to know why you have them, so you know how to take care of them, what's the priority of them, and things of that nature. And then keeping up with how your plants are doing. Maybe you have a lot of aphids on your okra this year, and so it's like, I need to write that down, so next year, what can I do to help prevent that, or what can I do ahead of time? My roses have things on them every year, it's a new thing, and so I do something to help from the next thing, and then somebody else finds it, and so it's just being mindful of that and kind of remembering from season to season what's working and what's not working. So the second step, so we talked about knowledge, so just knowing your garden and knowing your space. That also kind of goes to knowing your light. So knowing the abiotic factors as well. So we talked about, almost everything we talked about was biotic about the plant, so also know your space. The second thing is prevention. So kind of healthy plants have fewer problems. So if you have the right plant in the right place at the right time, ideally it goes well. There are lots of exceptions to that. We know gardening is not a perfection, and things still happen, but it's the healthier your plants and your shrubs are, the more likely they are to be able to overcome things on their own without assistance. Kind of like with babies and kittens, when they're babies, you need to help them a little bit. If you have a new transplant, you have a seedling, they will need no more help, even if they are natives and things like that. But once they are established, that is a big thing. So going back to kind of knowing your garden, who planted it, who designed it, was it you? Wonderful, we know a lot about it. Maybe it was, the person, maybe you're renting and it was the person who was there last year, you bought a house or have a space. So as much as you know, it is good. We also already kind of talked about what is normal for plants. So what do they look like if they lose leaves? How much do they lose? Maybe it's like a dog and they shed sometimes. So some leaf loss is fine during the year, or a whole coat blowout. That's if your whole tree just drops leaves. Maybe not so much. And then this kind of goes back to shifting our mindset. Breathing in, some things we're going to lose, some things aren't going to go well, and that's okay. And then breathing out. If we have a problem plant, maybe you've really wanted this plant to work, but it really needs sun, and where do you got to shade? Being able to kind of let that go, moving it to a different place. Maybe your neighbor has great sunny yards, and you can ask if maybe they'll keep it so you can still seed and stuff, and plant the right plant for your space. Please don't just go in your neighbor's yard and plant your plants. Ask first. But just kind of being mindful of the right plant in the right place. Also, buying plants at the right time of year is also a thing. Just because a nursery or a garden is selling it, that doesn't necessarily mean it's the right one for my yard. Such as Tess was talking about how some nurseries are selling invasive plants. It's nice that they put this big tag that says, hey, I'm invasive. But that just because it's available doesn't mean we should be planting it. Trees are a big thing like that. There are certain times to plant certain trees. Sometimes some trees do better in the fall because they can have a dormant time, they can kind of get established. Sometimes the winter's too harsh, so you need to do it in the spring. That's the same thing about pruning your plant, your trees and your shrubs. Some you want to do in spring so they spark up new growth. Some you need to do in the fall to kind of give them that dormancy. You tell them it's a winter time, conserve, they put out more roots and things like that. So just being mindful of the plant, the season. With trees, you have different things called like root balls, or they have bare roots and things like that. And just because somewhere's Lowe's is selling this tree and a plant ball, a root ball, that doesn't necessarily mean that's the best for the plant. So you might be starting at a disadvantage. So do a little research. I'm never against sporadic on the cuff buying of plants and making it work. I have definitely done that. But if you can, taking the time to do some research, especially if it's an investment plant, so like a shrub or a tree. If you just grab all the squash off the plant, or off the shelf, that's okay. They're only gonna last one year anyway. But
do you actually suggest pruning of trees?
Depends on the tree. I'm not gonna blanket statement.
Right.
That will get me in a lot of trouble right away. So I definitely recommend looking at your space, because sometimes you only have a space that's so big. You don't have 20 feet for this tree to go, and so you do need to do some pruning, or it's getting too close to your house or things like that. But most trees and shrubs, some you can just whack to the ground and they kind of need that to regrow and things. And some they can't take more than like 20 or 30%, cut every year kind of thing. So really look at your plan and see what it suggests. And if you have a particular one, we can talk about that afterwards.
I was just wondering, are there places to buy plants that are like, I don't know, by default going to be more like going to be responsive to the season? Like you mentioned Lowe's, and I was like, oh, I wonder if that's a little more like one size fits all, stock the same thing everywhere.
Yes.
Does it matter?
So it really just depends. A lot of places, Lowe's, Ace, they source from a lot of different places. And sometimes they source from local gardens, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes they also just source what they think people want to buy, not necessarily what's in season. I don't really have one place I recommend buying anything in particular. It just kind of depends on what you're looking for. I have had some success with Valley View up in Cockeysville. I know Herring Run, kind of on the northwest side of town, is great for natives. Like they only sell natives. If they don't sell it, it's not a native. Like, yeah. But I haven't purchased there, so I'm not trying to necessarily give recommendations. I'm just giving resources. Because I don't want to get anybody in trouble. So I don't know of anywhere in particular, and I think it all depends on what you're looking for, because I bet even if you went to Lowe's, some things are going to sell at great when they're in season, but they're also going to sell things that are not in season, if that kind of makes sense. It's kind of like how we can go to the grocery store and buy cantaloupe well, maybe not cantaloupe, but cucumbers year round, even though they're not here kind of thing. So just being mindful of that. And then also when we're looking at our plants, there are particular cultivars of plants, so kind of subspecies of plants that are resistant to certain things. So if you have basil that always gets not powdery mildew, or squash that get powdery mildew, or certain bugs like deer-resistant lettuces and things like that. That doesn't mean that they're guaranteed. It just means they're less likely. There's something that plant genetically has that makes it more resistant to certain pests. And there's not typically, we all know there's like 700 different types of tomatoes, and some will be resistant to some things, but not necessarily other things. So being mindful of what your garden has and what pros and cons it has to kind of know what pests maybe you need to look out for, things like that. So step 1 was knowledge, step 2 was prevention, step 3 is monitoring. This is a big one. So look at your plants regularly. It's kind of called scouting is the official term for kind of looking at your plants, and it says talking to your plants, just kind of seeing what's up, that sort of thing. If you have veggies, I definitely recommend doing it weekly. Some of those little critters can pop up. Also, a lot of your vegetables are growing really fast, so they kind of mature and do different things. And when there were no flowers maybe on the plant, it was fine, but as soon as it got flowers, it starts attracting other insects and things like that. With your natives, I definitely suggest looking monthly, during the big growing seasons, maybe every other week. And when I say monitor, I mean like go through it. Like I don't suggest for your tree you look at every leaf like you might with your tomato plant. But just get up close and personal. If you have like a little magnifying glass, you can look for like eggs and different things. With trees, you can have galls, and there's a lot of different things. And if you do see something, don't panic. Note it, research it, see what it is, and then kind of monitor it. So if I've got aphids on my, my okra, I was actually hoping I could find some to bring in to show you kind of what they look like, other than on a computer screen. For better or for worse, my methods have gotten rid of them. So between me and the ants, there's no more aphids. So I noticed it got better, so I didn't have to freak out about it. I've definitely lost plants to aphid infestations before, and that it happens, but we kind of noticed it and moved on. So also being aware of, so again, we're monitoring biotic things, so we're looking at the plant, we're looking at pests, your abiotic things. Climate change. It's a little bit hotter every year, it's a little bit hotter longer and things like that. We just had a huge storm, so now that I went through, or I looked, and maybe some of my plants had fallen off their trellis, so I kind of needed to put them back up and things like that. So it's a lot of different things that we need to look at. It's very important to start monitoring before things become a problem. So you need to kind of start in spring. It's good that you start noticing like, oh, I got a bunch of aphids, I'm gonna start checking them every couple of days to see if it's getting better or worse. But ideally, you're kind of looking at it beforehand so you can kind of catch things. Sometimes when you already see a big infestation, it might be too late. And then something. Okay, yes. So we were talking about things to monitor. Are the pests present or absent? So like maybe you're like, yes.
Question, so
Yeah.
about the pest piece. So like the birds are like they just don't care.
Yeah. So we can talk about specific things to do in a little bit. I don't have that problem, so I'd have to do some research. The birds eat your kale. What kind of birds? All right, that's a new one for me. Well, we'll talk afterwards and we'll figure out something for your kale. But so noticing what pests are present, whether it be bugs or birds, what times are they around? Like, did they wait until it was, full grown? Did they just happen to see it? Or, hey, last year I had tons of aphids, but this year I don't have aphids. So I wonder what I'm doing differently this year. Distribution, where are they? Are they just on one leaf? Is your problem? Maybe you're seeing leaf spots or something, and maybe that's a fungus or bacteria. You're like, is it on the whole plant or is it just in one area of my plant? So kind of noticing that, as well as again, is it getting better or worse? So we're starting to monitor. So the next thing that we would do, if it works, is diagnose. So what is going on with our plant? We know our plant is a problem. I've got some spots on it. I've either seen a bug, I haven't seen a bug, I know it's hot and it's wilty, I don't know what's going on. So kind of thinking of the life cycle of the plant, where is it? It's a shrub and it's a tree, kind of what season are we in? And what action, if anything, should I be taking? So the more you kind of know, again, about the plants, then you can kind of figure some things out. Google is your friend. Also, we talked last week about the Ask, and I realized it wasn't Ask an Expert, it's called Ask Extension now. And I think I sent the link out the last email. That is wonderful. That is a great tool for diagnosing. If you do send in things to them, make sure you're including as much as you can. Like, this is a plant in full sun, or a shrub, it's, I've had it for at least 2 or 3 years, so they kind of know like where it is in its maturity. It kind of did this wilty thing last year, and now it's a lot worse, so now I think I need to do something. Here's some pictures, different angles, things like that. There's tons of other resources we have, but just being as mindful as possible about all the information, because maybe a plant that's only 1 year old is going to have different problems than if it's a 10-year-old plant kind of thing. And some trees and shrubs have life cycles, so that it might just be, it's that, that tree's end of life. And that's just kind of what it looks like, and it'll kind of slowly produce less and less kind of thing. And then based on your research, what are some of the most likely culprits? And I kind of talked about it a little bit already, but one of the big things that we kind of start with, if we kind of think of like a big, I forgot what they're called, like organizational chart, like you start with like, I have a problem.
The hierarchy.
Yeah, maybe like a hierarchy kind of thing. So if I have a problem, I have two what's the first thing I kind of look for? Is it an abiotic problem or a biotic problem? That's kind of the first thing I need to look at. Can someone give me the differences between a biotic and an abiotic problem? It can be that. Who has some ideas of abiotic problems? Yep, that could be an abiotic thing. So soil could kind of go either way. So some nutrition could be abiotic, but then your soil, because that's kind of, I won't say living, but it is organic, ideally, some of it. So that could be a biotic thing. Any other ideas that people have? So like wind could be a thing. So if you're, storms, or depending on where it is, maybe on the side of your house, it's kind of more of a wind alley. So here's some different things. So biotic, obviously anything living. So other plants, so if you have a lot of weeds, maybe they're taking some of the moisture out of your soil, and so your plants are getting drier a lot faster. Other animals, such as our birds, some fungi, bacteria. And then our abiotic things are maybe air. Maybe it's a really bad pollution year or something, and so our air just isn't as clean, so some of our plants are struggling. We talked about soil, salt. If maybe you put too much salt on your sidewalk, maybe your front tree isn't looking so great, or some of your shrubs are suffering a little bit. That could be a thing. Temperature, light. Typically, sometimes it's not enough light. Right now, it's too much light. We have all these rays coming in and baking our plants that just aren't used to it. I'm not used to it. I'm from Florida. Water. Am I watering my plants enough? Are we getting enough rain? So Tess was talking earlier about natives. Ideally, once they get established, you don't really need to water them. But with our climate change and things like that, sometimes they need a little help. So if you notice it hasn't rained in a couple of weeks and they're a little sad, watering them. We also have some minerals. Someone did talk about pH and humidity. I think I had. So something else. I know someone had talked about humans in their garden, but there's also, while we have biotic and abiotic effects, we also have human influence. So the timing that I put plants in, how much attention am I giving to my garden? You could spend a lot of time or not a lot of time, and all of that's okay, but just being mindful about that and things like that. So sometimes if you're trying to diagnose a problem, you can look at a few cues to kind of help figure out if it is an abiotic problem or a biotic problem. So if there's multiple species adjacent to each other, so you have some shrubs, some trees, or you have some cucumbers and some tomatoes, and they both kind of have the same problem, it's likely an abiotic factor. So that could be your sun, that could be maybe my soil's maybe I didn't put enough, amendments to get some compost, but it's likely going to be an abiotic thing. If a single species is affected, so I've got my tomatoes that are looking a little sad, but my cucumbers look hi, then likely it's a biotic thing. So that's why I need to figure out if it's maybe a bacteria, is it a pest, what might be going on. And then if it's just like, maybe you have multiple tomato plants and only one is looking a little sad and the rest look great, then you don't know. Maybe it's being shaded by the trees, the tomatoes next to us is not getting enough sun. Maybe it's just kind of the runt of your litter and it's not getting the water and the water's going everywhere else and things like that. So sometimes it could be anything. And because I keep talking about climate change, that is definitely something that we're having problems with. So all of the high temperatures are affecting, at least with our fruits and vegetables, sometimes the fruit set. So either they're not getting pollinated or the flowers just aren't kind of coming out because the plant is so stressed that it can't produce all the flowers that it's used to producing. So in 2020, we had the warmest July on record. Apparently Baltimore had 25 days above 90 degrees, which is a little toasty. 2020 was also the warmest January through July period and the fourth wettest August. So while that's great, now your plants have water, they're also not used to being drowned in August. And so that can create maybe some funguses and things like that you haven't had to work with. So even though I'm thinking the water is great, I don't have to water because as I stated kind of last class, it's above 90. I'm maybe watering my vegetables twice a day. Now again, I have containers and so they evaporate from all sides and things like that. So that's a personal choice. But I get all excited, but now I have different problems in my garden. So just being mindful of that. We've also had a lot more late spring frosts that have happened. So tomatoes you're not really supposed to plant until I think things like Mother's Day. So basically your last frost, because that will kill your tomatoes. I'm an ambitious gardener and I kind of start putting things out in March and April, and I just know some things are going to make it, some things won't. But I have noticed the last few years, a lot of my stuff has been dying because we've had those late frosts into the late April. I think this may even have one, maybe not a full frost, but definitely a dipping of temperature, almost Mother's Day weekend. I was like, no, my tomatoes are supposed to grow outside. It also can accelerate ripening and maturing fruits. So sometimes they're soft because they haven't really had the time to absorb all the water that they need to. There's just a lot of things that can kind of affect with our climate change, and just being mindful of that. So we kind of talked about, so we'll talk later about like floating row cover and the pros and cons of that. So it's a barrier, so it helps kind of keep bugs out, but depending on the type you have, it can kind of trap in heat and almost acts like a little greenhouse. So being mindful of that. I think what we were actually trying to do here was block some of the rain from coming in a little bit. And then because of certain climate change, some pests are like, this is great. Like I liked warm temperature and now I like warm and wet temperature. And so these are white flies on some of our brassicas. So you get some of the caterpillars and things like that. And they're typically more of a southern pest, but we're getting them more and more. So, oh, also sunburn on plants. That is a thing. So step 5. So we have all our steps. 5. Take necessary action, and that's more of a take action if necessary. I guess I kind of wrote that wrong. So we're looking at our plants. We know either it's a biotic or an abiotic factor. So maybe there's not enough water. I need to water. That is an action in which I need to take. I have aphids on my plant. Maybe I don't yet. Maybe my action is just continuing to monitor. I'm going to keep looking, seeing what's going on, and then again being mindful of kind of what I have. So do my aphids, just because I had this the other day, that's what I'm thinking. Do my aphids need to be controlled? Going back to what's my threshold? I'm going to want okra leaf. I'm going to kind of watch it. I see ants on there. I know they like the honeydew produced by the aphids, which is aphid poop. And so that's what ants eat and things like that. So I'm like, I think the ants got it. I think they've got this figured out. It's just one of my plants. I have 6, so if I do lose this one, it's not the end of the world. You know, this is my personal threshold, not necessarily yours. Is it the life and death of a plant? So that kind of goes back to we're talking about like if it's seedling, a transplant, things like that need to be babied a little bit more. Then maybe you have less time to act and you need to monitor it more and things like that. Or maybe it's an established shrub and there's one branch is looking really bad and we're just going to kind of watch it, but the rest of my plant looks good. So it's not life or death for the plant. So we're just watching. The time of year, so when we talk about leaves dropping, is it already kind of losing some leaves, but it's fall anyway, so it's about to lose all of its leaves. Maybe I'll write this down, things to look for next year, but it's about to lose all of its leaves, so I don't really necessarily need to take action. Is it about to rain? That's for a couple different things. Your plants look sad, it's about to rain, then that could be good. Going back to aphids, one of the ways to get rid of aphids is to spray your leaves off. Obviously the rain isn't going to necessarily spray the underside of the leaves where the aphids live, but maybe there's things that the rain might help and kind of brush some pests off. Can you even control it? Sadly, this is something that happens. A couple years ago, parts of my garden got powdery mildew, and it is a biotic factor, but it did hit everything in my garden. Everything just looks powdery and white and things like that. And there are some things I could do, but at the same time, I kind of wasn't. I could, clip off the leaves that were super infected and kind of hope the rest went on. But at that point, that was definitely not something I could control. That was do the best you can with what you got with the time you have left. But that was the end of the vegetable. And then right plant, right place, right time. Was that plant even healthy to start with? Like, was it on the struggle bus, and this is now its 14th different problem I've had with it, and maybe I just need to let this one go. And so we'll kind of come back to action a little bit, but of course we have to treat it, not to treat. So that's something we need to think about. And then our last step is to evaluate and monitor. So I know it's kind of going back, but it's just thinking about what actions can I take, what do I need to take, and it's just kind of everything. And so one of the things that I really resonated with me when I first started as a master gardener was kind of this challenge, was setting up a garden journal. And it can be on paper, it can be online, it can be whatever you want, but the idea is that you kind of write down the 6 steps so that they're on, these 6 steps of knowing your garden. What can I do to prevent it? I need to constantly monitor. And by constantly, I mean once a week. Like, it's not something, we want your garden to still be fun. We don't want it to necessarily be a second job. So what, prevention, what kind of actions can I take, and am I following up? And then kind of pick like a mantra or a goal for this year. So in 2022, my goal will be to look at my plants every week and find out about tomatoes and cucumbers. Like I want to do research and I want to know about these two things. And maybe in 2023, I'm going to pick peppers and okra, and I want to really do research on that. Or maybe I want to put 2 more natives in my garden, or put 2 natives in your garden. Maybe we're starting from scratch, that's fine too. So I really want to learn about, some ground cover, clover. So I want to learn about that, or replace part of my grass, whatever that might be. Or maybe it's your mantra something, I want to be patient with my garden. I want to give it some time. I want it to grow. So it could make me action goals or just thoughts. We kind of talked about in step 1, but actually draw out your garden. Like grab some graph paper, grab Excel, kind of like plot some stuff, and then name as much as you can. And again, maybe this year you're just naming 3 things, and next year you learn 3 things, and then by year 3 you're gonna 9. Like that's a lot of things that you can share. You also, and you won't stop at 3. Let me tell you, once you get going, you'll keep going, and then you're gonna like start driving by your house and like, oh, my neighbor's got that tree. I remember somebody told me, oh, and you go home with it. You're like, I know what it is. That's the Bartlett pear. We need to get rid of that one. And maybe you share some knowledge with your neighbor. Maybe you don't. That's completely fine too. Or you go for walks in the neighborhood. Again, you're gonna start going like, what's that weed? What is it? I do that all the time. That's what you're gonna do. And so after you draw your garden, what plants are healthy and what might not be so healthy. So kind of getting a little status on your garden and things like that. And again, if you have maybe a front yard and backyard, start with just 1. Like make it manageable. Again, this is supposed to be fun and encourage like your brain and encourage your passion to continue to do this. This is not meant to be the end, the worst homework assignment you've ever done. And then set up notes. So like literally with dates. Like on July 22nd, I saw aphids on my okra. Sprayed them off with the garden hose, and that's it. And then maybe on the 6th, I went back, no aphids, that kind of thing. Or I've noticed, my pepper plant, 2 of the leaves are missing on the front one, looking for pests. And then next week you're like, oh, I'm now missing a lot of leaves. But you're like, I don't remember how much was last time unless you wrote it down. Unless you have a very good memory, and I do not. So I really suggest doing that. And again, and then also, maybe I saw the aphids, but I see ants there too. So like I now see that I've got maybe found some ladybugs or different things. So like you don't have, again, it's going back to the just monitoring your garden. Anyway, I really think this is a fun activity to do. You should try it. I don't know if I sold it or not, but oh wow, it's already 11:30. Okay, so we'll start on that. I really suggest this is good. It's kind of therapeutic. You feel connected to your garden. It gives you kind of something to do, whether it's vegetables or whatnot. And then it's really fun, at least for me, it was the 2nd year. And it was like, okay, so I grew, I know I talked about that Reddit post last time. I was talking about the ecosystem. But there was a really fun thing that was like, past me says, I will never have more than 1 zucchini plant at a time. Well, current me planted 6. Future me is really gonna hate, current me in a little bit kind of thing. So it's knowing that kind of stuff and like, how many tomato plants should I plant? I don't know. You get so excited, you plant seeds, you plant like 20 of them, and then when they actually start growing and they're 4 feet tall, and you're like, this is too many, I can't keep up with it. Or, it's just, also as you go, you kind of forget things. And so that's what I really like. You forget what bugs are on them. You forget how much things produce. So I actually even take it a step further, and I can share it is too much. It is crazy. Don't rate it all. But like literally, like I track when do I start harvest. So if I plant something on, March 1st, when can I start harvesting my first peas and things like that? And maybe how much did I get, because I like that kind of stuff. It also helps me assess, because again, I have a very small yard. What's worth it for me? Like my broccoli, I could never get a broccoli head bigger than this, and they take up so much space. So I've just learned, for me, brassicas aren't my thing. Like I get cabbage worms, they're very annoying. It took several years for me to realize, like, just not my thing. Like, let's plant some other stuff. There's other things I'd rather do with my time. And I think that's kind of the thing. Anyway, okay, so now we'll start going faster. Action. So we're kind of going back. Step 5. We do need to do something. We're past it. We have monitored it. We have looked at it. And we're like, okay, something needs to change. So what are we going to do? So we've ruled out abiotic causes, so we know it's not just the sun or the wind. And we've identified either a bug or a bacteria. Not only have we identified it, but it is past a threshold. So it is either going to kill my plant, it is past my aesthetic version, like we've got to do something. So now we've got to figure out how are we going to do something about it. So there's a couple of different strategies that we can pick. We have biological, physical, cultural, or chemical. So let's kind of go through those real quick. Biological. So this is kind of knowing ecology, and I know we didn't really have a lesson on it, so we'll kind of throw it in to start with. But there's a couple different biological controls. These are more like definitions. But basically the classical biocontrol that you think of is, I have a bad bug, I have a pest, what can I bring in to get rid of it? Or what can I encourage to come in? Because yes, you can go out and buy ladybugs and bring them into your garden to eat your aphids, but there's different pros and cons to that. I know people also, in the past, at least when I did my class, they would talk about buying praying mantises to come into their garden to put in there. We're going to talk about praying mantises in a minute. And so, but yeah, so there's different things. So what can I do? So one of like the aphids, and I have no idea why I'm stuck on aphids, but apparently I am. So one of the things that eat aphids is this green lacewing bug. So if you see aphids, then we see this little green bug, with these nice little lace wings. He eats aphids. So maybe I don't need to do anything because I have a biological control in my garden. They eat mites, soft body insects, so like aphids, some of the like cabbage caterpillars that we have, mealy bugs. Sometimes you'll get those on your succulents and things like that. So these are good bugs. And I think one of the other things that's important to know when you're looking at your plants is identifying all the bugs. Because you're gonna flip a leaf over and you're gonna see like 6 different bugs. And you're like, oh dear, like I'm infested. And then when you start looking down, you're like, oh, that was a bad bug, but look, there's like 5 good bugs on here and things like that. So not every bug is a bad bug. So that, I guess I should have started with that. Ladybirds, they also eat aphids. I saw this in my garden and went, what the F is that? Like I had no idea. It doesn't look like a ladybug to me. To me, it looks very creepy. Like it's a little different. I just hadn't seen it before. And then when I'm like, okay, let me grab my phone before I have a policy, before I kill it, I try to like Google tell me what it is. And I was like, oh, that's just ladybug larvae. That's fine. I had tons of them. I was very excited. I'm like, my garden is either, well, good and bad, because maybe that means you've got a lot of bugs that they need to eat, but at the same time, I know they're going to take care of my bug, right? So they also eat a lot of soft-bodied insects, so like aphids, scales, spider mites, and some arthropods, like little arthropods and things. So again, when we're talking about looking underneath your leaves and things, maybe you see some eggs. Sometimes that's bad, but sometimes that's good. So just being mindful and kind of knowing the different bugs that are in your garden, you'll kind of get used to. There's some that you always see, and so when you start seeing those, you're like, oh, that's okay. And if you don't know, you look it up, and that's good too. Or again, take pictures, send it in. This next picture isn't for everyone, so I apologize in advance. One of the other good bugs could be some wasps. And basically, there are some wasps that lay their eggs. This is I think it's actually a tobacco hornworm, not a tomato hornworm, but they're very similar. And they lay their eggs in the hornworms. And so what you're actually seeing are not eggs, but these are already the wasp cocoons. And so it's a parasitic wasp, but it's good. It's helping your garden. It's getting, okay, I'm getting some looks, so I'll take that one down. But it's one of those things that's good for your garden. Like you're thinking it's terrible, you're like, I don't want wasps, but wasps are actually a lot of wasps are pollinators. And so that's just another type of thing that we have in our garden. And again, you think bad bug, and you're like, actually maybe not a bad bug. So just being mindful and open, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. Okay, so that was some of our cultural strategies. Some of our physical strategies. So barriers. So literally physical barriers, such as the floating row cover we have. So a lot of focus. So a lot of barriers. So like the floating row cover. If you don't want to do floating row cover, sometimes Joann's has tulle, and like that's like cheap. So you could try that. Some bugs need a certain like mesh like distance, so maybe that might not keep the thrips out of your garden. But if you have like squash vine borers or something, covering your squash or your cucurbids or different plants with floating row cover, depending on how your garden is set up, can prevent some of those bugs from getting in while your plant's still developing. So we have mulch that can help with weeds. Weeds can be a pest. We talked about that last week. So doing some either green mulch or maybe your vegetable beds, maybe some straw or hay. Mulch is also very good because it helps keep moisture in the ground. So if your plants are maybe, if you have containers and they're drying out real fast, the mulch can help ease the evaporation, and so more of the water stays in the garden longer. Traps, by traps I mean So their cucumber bugs are a thing. Amaranth. You can plant amaranth in your garden. Might not necessarily do anything for you. Like, there might be a tea with it or whatever. But the cucumber bugs really like it. So you're basically giving the bugs somewhere else to go that's not your cucumber kind of thing. So that's what a trap is. I'm not saying a mouse trap, different kind of trap. Mowing or tillage. I'm not going to get at that one. Okay. Spray with high flow water. So like the aphids, a lot of bugs you can just kind of spray off your plants. How they don't come back, I don't know because they got there in the first place, but it really does work. So just spraying them off, getting rid of them. Hand picking, we'll talk about some of the bugs and sometimes you just pick them off. Or some people use like a roll of duct tape that they just kind of do like a little roll in the back of your hands so you're sticky. And you can just sometimes pick some of the bugs up that way. Those are slightly bigger bugs, like your stink bugs. You don't necessarily want to squish because they'll smell, but you can kind of pick them up that way and then dispose of them. And then sometimes you just need to prune or remove affected areas. So like some tomato, when you plant tomato, it's always advised once they get a good height and they're kind of going, to go back and clip the bottom leaves because there's not enough airflow, and without proper airflow you can get blight. So that's kind of a fungus that can get on your plants. For like you're kind of doing something ahead of time to give it a better chance. So that's even before it's affected. So that's more of a prevention kind of thing. Friends. Remember, I'm allergic to friends, so we have friends there. But that's okay. Okay, so we talked about biological, we talked about physical, cultural. So just being healthy, right plant, right place, right time. Healthy plants are less susceptible to disease and pests. That doesn't mean they won't attract them. We're part of an ecosystem, that's what we're building. But we are trying to either look for particular pest-resistant plants. I am not doing that because I haven't found it works too much, but I haven't done a lot of research into it. So it just really depends. But some of the things, kind of going back to the tomatoes, if they're too crowded on top of each other, that can lead to blight. And I'm sure other plants are like that too. You need to give them proper spacing. I know sometimes that's hard for some of us in container gardens and gardening on a patio. You're like, I only have 10 square feet. Like, I don't have lots of. So it's just being mindful of kind of what you're planting on top of it. I don't know if someone's going to talk about it next week. And I'm not advertising or recommending this. A resource you can look for is square foot gardening for vegetables. And so that's kind of a different method in trying to use small spaces efficiently. And they kind of talk about maybe plants you can kind of plant next to each other. And even though your tomato packet might say 3 feet between each, you might not need to. Now your plant might not last as long, and there's other things, but it's a way to look. If you do have small spaces, look at that. And I can answer questions off, but that's technically a whole different program that I am not qualified to teach, but I have a little experience with it. So again, choosing either bug resistant or drought resistant plants. If you know, like, hey, I've got containers and I can only water every couple of days, how are you setting your garden up for success the best way you can? Timing of seedings and planting. So that goes back to not planting something too early when you know it's going to get frost damage, or a lot of bugs, when you're doing your research, sometimes they say plant a little bit later in the summer because maybe a particular bug has so I think the squash vine borer has 2 life cycles typically in a year. So if you plant a little bit later in the summer, you potentially have missed the first life cycle. So maybe it can get established and get growing and you get some fruit out of it before it gets infected. So at least you got something out of it, things like that. Raised beds, one of the reasons raised beds are good, as well as crop rotation. Sometimes bugs overwinter. So if you have squash vine borers, for instance, they can go, they live in the dirt. So you don't want to plant there for 2 years to let them get out. So for the biggest ability that you have, kind of like rotate what you have. It's also good for a lot of your soil and your amendments and things like that, because certain plants take certain nutrients out. So by kind of spreading that out, you kind of gives you a chance to refill things. Okay, and then this last one I know is going to be a little controversial depending if you ask your baywise and your pollinating people, but it's just being mindful of what are ideal situations for pests. So like, if I have a rat problem, I don't want to leave tons of cardboard boxes and all of my tree shrubbery in the back alley so they can just make a nest out of it. But at the same time, we do want to be mindful of, if we want spaces for our helper bugs to come, they need somewhere to live too. So there's a little bit of a give and take. So you still need to have a clean space, but they do need some debris and things like that. So it's just looking that up. I didn't talk about praying mantises, but I do want to talk about that real quick. So praying mantises are a good bug and a bad bug. They're a good bug because they do eat some pests and things like that. The reason why they're a bad bug is they're what is called a generalist bug. So they will also eat your good bugs. They will also eat your ladybugs. They will also eat your bumblebees. They don't really care what they eat. So they will eat some of your aphids, but then they might eat your lacewings too, and that kind of defeats the point. So they're very fun. I enjoy seeing them in the spring. I normally can find 1 or 2 babies around or things like that. But I wouldn't personally go out and buy praying mantises to put in my garden. Cool? Good bug, bad bug. Okay, chemical strategies. I know we heard Tessa's thoughts on chemicals. As a master gardener, apparently there's a lot of certifications you have to get to talk about pesticides. So I'm not going to talk about pesticides because I'm not qualified to talk about pesticides. That might give you an idea of we don't recommend using pesticides unless you need to, kind of thing. I'm not going to stop you from going to buy a bottle of Roundup. I just want you to be mindful about what you're doing when you do that. So if you do decide to use pesticides, and sometimes you might need to use an insecticidal soap, that's the only thing that gets rid of X. And that's up to you. Talk to people who are smart about it. Do your research from scientific places before you do it. If you do need to use it, try to use it selectively. So just use it on the spots that you need it, unless it's a preventative type thing. Don't spray it on everything because you don't know what it's going to do for different plants. A lot of pesticides will also, or be very careful about broad spectrums, they might also get the good bugs too. So that's one of the big problems with using pesticides and things like that. If you're using them to get rid of weeds or using them to get rid of aphids or whatnot, they're very likely to get rid of your bumblebees, your ladybugs, your annuals, things like that. So just being very mindful about how you do it. They tend to persist in the environment for a little while, so also being mindful like when you're spraying. You also want to be very careful. I missed talking about watering, but the same thing kind of goes for spraying pesticides. You want to do it at a certain time of the day, maybe ideally in the afternoon, so that because some plants can get basically pesticide burn. And so if you have pesticide on your plant and then you have a lot of hot sun, it can, even though you're trying to go for a certain bug, it can kind of kill your leaves off and things like that. So just be mindful about when you do it. Always please read the directions, use the safety materials. I understand with Roundup you might not need to actually put your goggles on, but just read it, know what it does, things of that nature. Okay, yes, so I also want to talk about watering for a hot second. I know Tess talked about it. We talked a little bit about, top-down watering isn't great for a couple reasons. It can, scald your plants because of the reflections of the water. If you are going to water, do you know the best time of the day to water? Morning is good. Have some vegetables. I realized I had a lot and I haven't gotten them out yet. So there's tomatoes from my garden, zucchinis from out there, and 1 cucumber from my garden. So morning is good. Also, late afternoon is not bad. You just don't want to do it in the peak of the sun for several reasons. One, you can scald your plants. Also, it's just going to evaporate faster than your plants can really absorb it. Morning, I think, is the best time because if you do get any water on the leaves, it kind of can slowly, as it's warming up, things like that, it can kind of evaporate. You also want to do a low and slow, so if you can, misting your plants kind of, instead of just, and I understand people have different time allowances for watering and things like that, but if you have like one of the hoses with the adjusters, and not a mister or a shower is better than like obviously you don't want to jet your plants and things like that. But with my raised garden, one of the things I've noticed with my containers is my soil gets what's called hydrophobic. And so even if I water it, it's just gotten so dry that the water just goes straight through it. And so what I suggest doing, raised beds, containers, whatever you have, go home, especially with all these 90-degree days when it hasn't just stormed and given you all this nice water, is like dig down about 2 inches, like not into roots or anything, but kind of between plants. And like, is it dry? Or is it wet? Like maybe the day after you water kind of thing. Like even right after you water, is it actually wet? Sometimes if you get hydrophobic soil, what you have to do is you literally just have to soak it. And sometimes you have to get in there, kind of stir it up, and so you actually make sure that all of your soil is getting wet. This tends to be a bigger problem if you, I don't want to say the better the soil you have, but if you have like peat moss in your soil, that's something that can just kind of, or coconut coir, that can dry out, and then once it's dry, it's dry until you've re-soaked it. Sphagnum moss can be kind of the same way. Some of the composts can be the same way. So some of the things that you're putting in your garden because you want to give your garden nutrients can also be the things that kind of dry out. So they just take a little bit more attention. But yeah, so I really suggest digging in. If you're like, well, man, I watered this morning, I watered last night, I watered yesterday morning, and my plant is just so wilty, really go in there and look and see if you have hydrophobic soil. If you do, I can talk to you about it and things like that, but that's something I've really noticed that I have a problem with. So doing the misting and just basically giving the soil time to absorb the water compared to like a downpour where it just goes right through and then you wonder what's wrong with your plants. We're like, well, it can't be water, but maybe it still is. Okay, is there anything else on the list? No. Okay, cool. So here's some resources. The rest of my presentation I've kind of stolen, and we can go through it quickly for those who want to. It talks about some particular bugs and things. So we talked last week about the HGIC website. I actually thought I literally at one point had a line that said add extension, just like what Tess was saying earlier about if you Google something to try to get the science of it. I totally recommend reading on Reddit and forums and like, oh, this worked for me and that didn't. I think I talked last week about recipes. So like, look at a lot of different things because maybe this thing everyone recommends for aphids, do this thing and that's just not working for you. Get ideas from other places, but know what they are. Like, are they science backed, or is this someone's just story that they crossed their fingers, stood on one foot, and waved, and it just happened to work? So just know that going into it. But yes, and then when we say extension, it doesn't have to be the Maryland extension. Purdue has a really good one. Colorado's is huge. Again, being mindful, Purdue's a little bit better because that's closer to us, so they have the same like planting zones and things like that. But how to deal with maybe tomato hornworms could be kind of universal things like that. So just be mindful. And again, I'll send this presentation out. Here we go. Different topic, and this one says UND extension because it came from a UND employee. But anyway, even just the extension journal, that it goes back to the science and things like that. So any questions? Yeah.
I'm wondering about, like, when you have a dog that runs around your yard, I wonder if you have any master gardeners or the people who do the Baywise inspections. I was thinking of them with her. Because if you remove grass, like, I'm almost wondering about, like, native ground covers or things that aren't toxic. And where would be a good place to
So there are definitely options that you can do. Because and when we say grass, I don't know if Tess said grass is bad, but like that's still I hate absolutes. It is not the best for the environment. It's not necessarily adding a lot. But if you have kids, you have a dog, like you might need grass, and that's okay. It's just evaluating your space. If you had a yard, it would be very cool. The size of this room, do I need lawn the size of this room? Or maybe I just need something like these 3 tables, and then I can start doing some stuff over here. So if you need grass, use it. Like it's perfectly fine. But I know one of the things that they talk about in Baywise is, again, going back to, say you have a large space and you want to just slowly start getting rid of some grass, maybe just make like a foot border every year. And every year you just get rid of a foot more kind of thing. You just slowly till you find the space that you want. There are ground covers, clover's great, different things like that. So yes, definitely follow up with Tess. But there are ways to either have your cake and eat it too, or have spaces that aren't all trees because you've got to go somewhere, and things of that nature. So yes, there are multiple ways to accomplish the same thing. Anything else? Cool. And if anybody's got to go, they're completely fine. I was going to run through some bugs if you're interested in them, but I'm completely fine if you've got to step away. I wasn't being mindful of time. I apologize. So I will get going, and I'm not offended if you leave. So one of the big things when we're talking about pests, and I'm going to talk 90 miles an hour, I apologize, feel free to stop me, is, again, going back to IPM, what is a big problem versus what is a little problem. So we have a squash bug over here, or a stink bug, I think. Yes, stink bug. And then we have a striped armyworm over there. Armyworm, not bad bug. Bad bug. Tolerable bug. We can do things about it. So it goes back to just kind of looking at what kind of pests do we have. Stink bugs, yellow striped armyworm. And then again, where some of this is repetitive. So biological controls. What are things that we can do? What are how can we get good bugs into our garden and to help with the bad bugs? Sorry for this is more of the parasitic worms. This is a stink bug that's spearing a potato peeler. So even though it's a stink bug, it's still kind of helping us take care of some of our other things. So again, knowledge and research. What are we can have tiers of bad bugs, I guess. I'll get rid of So these are bugs that either I have in my garden or are very popular in Maryland. So we have cucumber beetles. There's two different kinds. So we have the spotted and the striped. They can overwinter your garden. They can affect any part of your plant. So they can affect the fruit, the leaves, and the flowers. Something to think about with bugs. Some only affect certain places. One of the bad things with the cucumber beetle is they can spread bacterial wilt. So you kind of are like, oh, my cucumbers just are thirsty, and you water them, they still look kind of sad, and they eventually just kind of die. They likely have this bacterial wilt. These bugs are very hard to hand pick. They jump, they fly, good luck. I definitely have them in my garden, but I've never had like a bad enough infestation that's really affected my garden. I might have lost like a sucker like on a string of cucumber, but for me they haven't killed a whole cucumber. You have to worry about lookalikes. There's a few other ones. So again, this just goes back to knowledge and educating yourself and things of that. I don't think I've seen any of them, but I do know there are lookalikes depending where you are. And this is just some of the damage that they can do overall to your plants. So some of, this is kind of where they eat, they're eating in different areas. Doesn't mean your cucumber's bad. Just cut it open, look at it, things like that. But it's just to show that they can affect multiple parts of your plant. I apologize for getting into that. So I talked about they are difficult to hand pick. So you can use floating row cover. The thing with using floating row cover for your cucurbits, so your squashes, your cucumbers, they need to be pollinated to flower. Where like your tomatoes don't necessarily. If you have tomatoes, you can kind of shake the stem and they kind of self-pollinate. It's wonderful, I love it. But the squash and the cucurbits do. So you want to take that floating row cover off once they start flowering, and not necessarily right when they start flowering. I know they're going to talk about the vegetable class, looking at with squash, there's male flowers and female flowers. The female flowers have the fruit underneath them, the male flowers do not. So normally with a lot of your cucurbits, and you'll have male flowers first before you start seeing the fruit. So just being mindful about when you need to start taking off the row cover and things like that. But if you leave the row cover on, you'll never actually get any fruit. So some things you can keep on, some things you can't. And then this talks about planting a little bit later. You can also plant multiple crops. So like with my cucumbers, and that's something that you might want to do anyway. It's called succession planting. So I might plant a cucumber in April, I might plant one in May, and I might plant one in June, kind of in different areas, because that'll help you get fruit later throughout the season and things like that. And if something happens to one, you didn't lose your entire crop. Also, if you have the space, I personally like to spread out my plants. So like, again, like literally plant them in 3 different areas. So if something got to something, or maybe I'm learning an area doesn't work, or I have trellising in certain areas, but I don't. So just being mindful of that. So this is the row covers that we were talking about. There's a lot of different things. I use Tool. I know it doesn't block all bugs because it does tend to have wider holes, but it is very cheap. So that is a good thing to be used. They can also be reused, so you can use them from season to season, so you don't need to throw them away. And this talks about making sure to remove it. So we have orange things under eggplant leaf. These are Colorado potato beetles. I don't plant potatoes, so I don't have this particular bug, but they also look very similar to our ladybug eggs, don't they? So, being mindful. So if you have beans, a Mexican bean beetle is frequently a problem. They, again, do the defoliation. They skeletonize a plant. So if you kind of look, you basically can just see like the little veins, but none of the leaf between the veins is there. And again, this is, so these you can hand pick off. If you see the eggs, you can wipe them off, things like that as well. Okay, and this is what some of the nymphs look like. So again, a lot of bugs from the egg to the nymph to the adult, they all look very different, kind of remember a ladybug and things like that. So just different things to look for. Harlequin bugs. So these are going to be on brassicas or something. There's something else, but anyway, this is what they look like. This is one of the plants that you can use your duct tape little hand fun things to make sure you don't get the actual plant. Their eggs look really cool, but they are very tiny. They're going to be kind of hard to see, but if you see this stripy pattern, you know pretty easily what you've got. So it's nice that they're very identifiable. Squash bugs. So these are not your squash vine borers, but they will eat your fruits and your leaves. So this is a stippling pattern that you might see. They can be very invasive very quickly. So kind of like your aphids, if they get out of control. Another one that you can use your little duct tape. They do overwinter, and they like. I've not had a butternut. So some with squash, sometimes your winter squashes, so like your binding squashes, your butternut, your spaghetti, your delicata, things like that, sometimes don't get the same squash bugs like the squash vine or the squash bugs that some of your summer squash get. So that's something. You have a problem with like your cucumbers, your zucchinis, your squash, things like that, where they keep getting eaten or they keep falling apart. You can't do it. Try a winter squash. Sometimes, depending on your garden and the bugs you have, that might be more successful. So here's our little duct tape method that I was talking about that you can just kind of think. And again, for anything later, that's also an idea. So any idea what this might be? So we have some stippling. We're running really low on time, so I'll just go. So this is spider mites. So you kind of flip your plant over and it looks like white and mesh and everything spider mites. One of the things we talked about earlier was, or we didn't talk about, but I just now realized it, for barriers, diatomaceous earth. This is something that you can use on the spider mites. This is basically crushed up fossils. And so for a lot of your mites and your arthropods with the hard shells, basically the dust of the fossils gets underneath their shell and basically itches them to death. So it's not a pesticide, it's safe for your garden. You can also pile diatomaceous earth around like the base of tomatoes, and it keeps slugs from getting into your plants. So that's a multiversal. Anyway, you got it. So it does a lot of stuff. Yeah, there we go. Words hard today. So diatomaceous earth is a good one, but because it is such a powder and it can get under there, so if you inhale it, a lot of it is not good. So make sure you use a mask. Maybe use eye protection because it can kind of irritate your eye too. But yeah, I just put that in a Gatorade bottle, like poof it on plants or whatever, no water or anything. And that kind of helps with my plants. I hate this plant, squash angora. I do something every year, multiple years to it. I never see the actual fly. You just kind of notice your squash zucchini kind of starts falling over and dying, and then you pull it up and the entire inside's gone. So if you notice, you just look for these tiny little eggs on the stems. Sometimes you see fracas of bug poop on your stems. And there are ways to kind of like cover it up and kind of potentially save the plant. I will just put that to you Googling it, just kind of knowing what squash vine borer damage looks like. I have learned that I would just rather go buy squash from the farmer's market, and that's another one that I've just abandoned. And that's okay. Maybe you really like squash and you had success, and that's great. I personally do not. Wildlife, we're going to talk about in our fourth class. Sarah's going over some presentations about how to get the good, like owls and things like that into your garden, and how to get rid of the bunnies and the rats and things like that. But these are just, covering your garden, having fences. These also help with people sometimes. So that and then again, remembering that everything's a biotic thing and abiotic. So these tomatoes have blossom end rot, which is either a watering problem or a potassium problem. Calcium, thank you, yes. It is a calcium problem. This is sun scald, and this is, I actually have a herbicide injury. So, that's Colton, that's they can look similar. So, but again, the herbicide has just burned the plant, which even though you got rid of your bug, if you lose your plant, what did you kind of do? Things of that nature. So here's a lot of things that can impact your plant. And if you notice, a lot of them are actually abiotic factors. So don't always assume my plant has a bug. It could be a lot of things: heat, cold, not enough nutrients, different things. This is showing poor pollination. So we kind of talked about, the male flower and the female flower has the fruit behind it. So if your zucchini or squash kind of look like that, it wasn't pollinated very thoroughly. So maybe you need to look into hand pollinating, things like that. And again, they're going to talk about that during the vegetables class. And then we won't go into all the diseases. So thank you so much. I will make sure to send this out. And then the rest of it will be on here, and you can always reference and things like that. Next week, I will not be here, but you'll have different hosts and other presenters, I promise. Kill this real quick.